Hi everyone, so it's been a while since I don't make another music related video, and I find that it's just kind of hard to come up with ideas for those kinds of videos, especially because I myself I haven't been really looking for that much new music lately. I've been reading much more often than I had been in previous years, and overall I just also feel like I don't really have that much to argue and really say about music, since I don't really know that much about theory and all these things. So a lot of my music related videos are really based on my personal feelings and my personal experiences, and all these very subjective things. But regardless, I hope that you are somehow entertained by these music related videos. And I was thinking of and looking back to maybe 2010, or just overall a while ago, when I first started listening to music, or when I first started actively looking for new music to listen to, and music that I hadn't been exposed to before, which I was around 12 at the time, and or maybe 11, I'm not really sure, but I think it was around 2009 or 2010. That was the year that I was started to actually really actively get interested in finding listening to music, and metal was really the first genre and the main one that really clicked with me. And so I wanted to list a few, or really many, around 10 albums that I particularly cared for and loved back when I had started listening to metal, which some of them may be kind of more surprising than others, I guess. But I used to, just based on my memories, some of these I very strongly have memories of listening to them in like late elementary school, on 6th grade. I used to write down lyrics from my favorite songs down on my notebooks for some reason, just for entertainment, I guess. So as usual, don't expect me to give a full review of every album that I mention, especially because, again, these are just kind of personal takes on them, and also I want to talk about how I feel about them now in contrast to how I did back then. More than 10 years ago. The first one that I thought about when I started to write down this list was Kreator, Enemy of God. This is sort of the quintessential 2010 album for me, in the sense that it's the one that I associate the most, I associate the most strongly with that year. It obviously didn't come out that year, it came out in 2005. But I listened to it so much in 2010, much more, even more than Hordes of Chaos, but I did like both of them. I don't know why that this one clicked so much with me, and now I have to admit that it's not really their best one, but I guess the melodicness of it was what I found the most attractive to me at that age, rather than their earlier stuff. Probably because I had been listening to so much Iron Maiden, and I had started liking them before I discovered Kreator, so it seemed a bit closer to what I was used to listening to, I guess. I find it funny now, the lyrics to me seem so deep at the time, especially songs like The Ancient Plague, which I still think it's a very good album closer, and I think this album overall shows a lot of passion and interest in still making good thrash metal, which I think it's a bit more than can be said for other thrash bands at this time. Around this time, I also really liked Violent Revolution, which had come out previous to Enemy of God, and I think it also serves to be a part of this list. I listen to that one very often, especially the title track, Servant in Heaven, King in Hell, and Replicas of Life, especially. Those I really like those, especially for some reason. I also have a soft spot for their 90s albums, their weird, I guess, experimental 90s albums, mostly because that's how I found out about goth music and about bands like the Sisters of Mercy. And once I listened to the cover of Lucretia My Reflection, I went on to listen to the original song, and I fell in love with that song, with that genre, with that band, with the Sisters of Mercy and goth music as a whole, and I still am very strongly into goth music, and gothic rock. And I also really like Outkast from their albums and Endorama. And Outcast especially, I think, is just kind of spoke to my teen insecurities, my early teen insecurities about being alone and being the outsider and all these things. So I do have a soft spot for them as a whole and for discography overall, even their bad albums. Maybe not Cause for Conflict as much. If I had to pick a least favorite album by them, it would still be Cause for Conflict. They were actually my favorite band overall from maybe ages 12 or 11 to 13 or 14. So for quite a while, at least an important time of my early teens, they were my favorite band. Another one is Slayer Seasons in the Abyss. And this is actually still my favorite album by them. War Ensemble, especially Dead Skin Mask, Hallowed Points, and of course the title track. And I also really like Blood Red. I like that one more than I did before, I think. I think the songs are just particularly catchy and yet very interesting, and they age very well, you know, you don't really get bored of listening to these songs. And so I think that's probably why I still like this album just as much as I did before. One by them, though, that I used to like more than I do now is World Painted Blood, which had been their most recent one when I started listening to them. I think I was particularly drawn to this album because of that. And of course, it came out that same year, I think 2010. I don't really care for this album as much anymore. If I had to pick a favorite by them now, outside of their 80s, obvious 80s ones, I would say it would be Divine Intervention. I don't really love all the songs equally, but I think this is overall their most interesting album out of their post-80s ones. The mood of this one, don't you think it's a bit different than the usual Slayer thing? I don't know, I feel like there's something about it, or maybe it's the album cover that makes me feel differently towards it, but I do feel like there's something about it that's a bit more understated, I guess, or maybe it's just the title track Divine Intervention that feels a bit more, I don't know, it feels more melancholic than aggressive, I guess. Not by much really, definitely not, but I think it's a bit more interesting. It does something for me that the other albums by them don't, and I really like it. I think it's kind of I'm not sure that I would say underrated, because a lot of people do say that this is their favorite more recent one, as in their non-80s albums. But yeah, I do like this album a lot, and I won't necessarily say it's their best one, but and I do remember liking some of the songs here as an early teen, Divine Intervention and probably Serenity and Murder, but I appreciate the album as a whole much more than I did before. But I think something about World Painted Blood that just didn't, there's something about that album that just didn't age well for me. Maybe it's something very personal or very subjective, but I think it sort of reminds me of being that sort of like edgy metal kid in 6th grade and doing things that were kind of cringe. This reminds me more of that time in Latin America where reggaeton was really big and really trendy. I mean, it still is, but back then it was probably the most popular genre, and you could never skip it. You listen to it everywhere you went, there was something playing. And it reminds me of that time in the late 2000s where some metalheads in the internet, especially on the internet, were making videos like reggaeton sucks and metal is better, and videos about, or you know how it's very cliche now, but back then it was very common that whatever metal video existed, there had to be so many comments about how one was born in the wrong generation and how you listen to metal instead of listening to that other bad music, whatever other bad genres were mentioned as being, the comparison ones. And I don't know, I feel like for some reason this album reminds me so much of that, probably because the lyrics don't really help. Some of them are so like edgy and not in the same way that their earlier stuff was. They feel a bit more like in your face, I guess they almost don't really feel as genuine as their previous ones. I think some of the lines just seem like they were written after they knew what kind of formula they had to write in order to make Slayer lyrics, they seem sort of like a parody of themselves in a way in some of the songs more than others. I think Playing with Dolls and the title track especially, that's what I mean when I say that it's not genuine, not really that, because I know that it's not like they really mean anything that they say either way, not directly through their lyrics. And overall there is something nostalgic and nice about this album, but I don't know, most of these albums, and especially ones that I haven't been listening to that much lately, they give me kind of good feelings, they give me mostly very good feelings. They remind me of a time when I was a tween and I was kind of finding my identity, and whenever I listened to metal, I felt really free, and I felt like I was suddenly understanding who I really was and kind of what place I had in comparison to other people, or my place in the world, or my place in I don't know, my relationships with other people. And I don't know, I guess it helped me start to understand what kind of person I was, or what kind of person I wanted to be. And I think it's also because before I listened to metal, I didn't really know what music was, I didn't really know what music could do and what it could be. So those feelings of finding these bands, all of these bands, almost not really at the same time, but kind of finding them almost all at once, and being so in love with all this new music that I was finding, and being so hopeful to find even more music that I could love. And that was such a nice feeling, and that's something that I'm reminded of when I listen to these albums again. So a general band, not really an album, but a band that I overall got really, really into back in 2010 or 2009 most likely, was Iron Maiden. And of course, that's the shirt that I'm wearing. I'm wearing the Aces High single cover shirt. But this, I picked this album because, of course, this was the first one. Well, I think the first one that I listened to was Fear of the Dark, but I don't like that one as much anymore. Usually, when I listen to a band, I usually listen to it or I started, finding new bands via Wikipedia. So I would go and, when you look up the name of a genre or a subgenre or something, at the end there's gonna be like list of bands that are this genre. If you look up heavy metal, one of them is Iron Maiden. So you look up the entire discography, and I generally would listen to their first studio album first, and then would go and listen to their releases chronologically. And that's generally how I discovered bands and how I discovered the discography. So, which is kind of boring, I guess. It's kind of like a boring story. Like, yeah, Wikipedia is like the more obvious way to discover new music. It's not exactly an anecdote or anything that's super fun. But, it is how I did it, especially because it was already 2009 and 2010, and it was very easy to find things through Wikipedia and just find whatever song you wanted to listen to. So I'm not really sure that I necessarily listened to this album before the other ones, but I think this one clicked more out of all of them, probably because it has a lot of really catchy songs. It's one of their most known ones, and because Hallowed Be Thy Name is still one of my favorite songs by them. And a couple of years ago, I was finally able to listen to that song live, and it was a whole new different experience, because they couldn't play that song live during the Book of Souls tour, which was the first time I saw them live. I do love it, but I definitely don't think it's their best one, but it is definitely still like probably top 4 or top 3 by them. But yeah, I do think it's a bit overplayed, some songs more than others. But I mean, I love this album just as much as I did before. But I also kind of have grown to appreciate other albums by them more than I did before. Especially, I think, The X Factor, which is very underappreciated. And I didn't get into Seventh Son initially that easily. I liked Somewhere in Time a lot, but Seventh Son got me a little bit. I needed to listen to it a couple of times in order to really get into that album. And now it's probably my favorite one. Not sure I'm kind of between that and Somewhere in Time, but those two are definitely my favorite ones, at least that I'll do like a bit over this one. So another one that I tie a lot to 2010 and maybe 2011 especially is Symbolic, which a lot of people have this as one of their favorite albums of all time, and so do I. I think this is just as great as it was before for me. I remember that this was a CD that I wanted my parents to buy for me for Christmas, probably 2011 or 2010. And of course, I still have it, as you can see. It's one of those, with the sleeve and everything. And even though I tie it a lot with 2010, I feel like out of all of these albums, this is one of the ones that I listen to the most still today. The most often, not all the time, because of course, of course I want to sometimes listen to new stuff. Sometimes I feel like I give myself this idea that I shouldn't listen to something that I love too often, because then it will stop seeming special to me, or I will get tired of it. Another album that is very tied to those times, to 2010, is Sodom M16. And I think this one is mainly because the songs in that album are super catchy, just maybe more than their other albums. It took me some time to get into their discography overall. I was really into Obsessed by Cruelty, but then after liking M16 a lot, I started getting into Agent Orange and Persecution Mania, which is probably my favorite one now. And I guess that's kind of an obvious pick. A lot of people have Persecution Mania as their favorite one. Sometimes I do listen to some of the songs there, especially the title track, Napalm in the Morning, Little Boy, Marines, Genocide, yeah, and Surfing Bird maybe. I mean, bit of a weird song, but I think that's probably the album where it makes the most sense to have that cover there. But for the most part, I feel like M16 hasn't really aged that well for me. I haven't listened to Obsessed by Cruelty either in a while. And one that I have been appreciating more now than I did before is Tapping the Vein. I had listened to it, but I guess I hadn't really listened to it carefully or paid attention that much, or had really given it that much of a hopeful listen, I guess. And then once I listened to it a couple of more times, I realized that it was actually a very good one. And I probably now like Tapping the Vein more than I do M16. An album that I was really into back then is Candlemass, King of the Grey Islands, which is really odd. I think this is the first album by them that I listened to, or at least the first one that I got really, really into, from what I remember anyway. I liked Devil's Seed, Clear Sight, and Man of Shadows especially. But it's really strange because ever since I've gotten into their earlier stuff, I haven't really looked back at all. I just don't really care for King of the Grey Islands as much, nearly as much really as I did before. It's just not quite as, grandiose and majestic, and it doesn't have as much of the same feel as the earlier ones do, and that's partly because of the vocalist, of course. The newer vocalist in King, I think, is great, but he can't really do exactly what Messiah Marcolin was doing for Candlemass in the earlier albums, which they didn't have him in the first album, I think, but those great albums by them, Nightfall and Tales of Creation, he was there, and those are probably their most iconic ones, and the ones that I like the most now. One that I find kind of weird now is Metallica, Death Magnetic. This was, of course, their most recent one by the time I started listening to metal, so I remember listening to A Nightmare Long and Cyanide and The Forgiven 3, and I don't really listen to that album at all now. I really listen to Metallica overall. I don't really know why, but I haven't listened to this album especially in several years. Sometimes I listen to their classic albums, but that's about it. And it's very strange to me because when the few times that I have listened to Nightmare Long and Cyanide more recently, I'm like, why did I ever listen to these that often? I mean, they don't really seem like particularly good songs to me now. I do feel some type of way about The Unforgiven 3. The whole Unforgiven series, or trilogy, I actually like that a lot from them. And I'm kind of, I don't know, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Metallica as a whole, but I really like their kind of acoustic or more ballad songs. Another one is Theater of Tragedy. I always find it hard to pronounce that, but the album specifically is Velvet Darkness, They Fear. This just clicked to me more than their first album, their self-titled album, and also more than their third album, which a lot of people like much more than Velvet Darkness. But there was something in Velvet Darkness that really spoke to me for some reason, and I was listening to that album over and over, and I never got tired of it for some reason. I don't know, and it's strange because I know I don't really register it as one of my favorite albums of all time, even though it really is. I guess just the fact that I don't really listen to gothic metal that often itself kind of makes me forget that I really love this album. Now, there's some other bands that I also liked around this time, but I can't really say for sure that I was listening to them in 6th grade. I feel some of them I was probably listening to around 2011 when I was already like in the first grade of junior high or whatever you may call it, but when I was already 12 and I was gonna be 13, I guess, I don't really remember. But there were some bands that I was listening to more between 12 and 13 rather than from 11 to 12, which include a bunch of goth bands, mostly the Sisters of Mercy and Joy Division, but also The Gathering is a metal band, you know, kind of a, I guess that's kind of debatable because they had a lot of non-metal albums, but and listening to The Gathering overall got me into other types of music that weren't necessarily anything like metal, like some types of electronic music, trip hop, for example, which I really like a lot nowadays. Because, you know, The Gathering was kind of experimenting with that sort of thing, and I also really ended up getting into Massive Attack and Portishead over, you know, that was more during high school, but that was definitely something that I think I was more into partly because I had been listening to Gathering, and also that band had been influenced by Dead Can Dance, which is also a goth band that I am now really into and is one of my favorites now. So yeah, they influenced my tastes a lot, and even today I don't really listen to them that often, probably because I listened to them so much back then that I basically tired myself out from listening to them. But yeah, I definitely do remember being really into that band. And another album, really strange pick that I can think of is actually Exodus, the Human Condition is it Exhibit A, the first one. There were two, but I'm talking about the first one. I really liked the song Children of Worthless God or something like that. But it took me a while to even remember that I liked that one because I haven't been listening to it at all in a while. I have been listening. I'm not really that much into Exodus as a whole. I like their earlier albums, of course, but even those ones I don't really listen to that often. So yeah, it feels good to look back at those tastes that I had 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now. I feel like I should have published this or, you know, made this before the 30th because it's Day of Children's Day and all that. But yeah, I don't know. It's a much more recent concept that I just came up with. And I think maybe my next video, I'm not sure what it's, my next music related video, I'm not sure what's gonna be, but I get the feeling I might be updating my Iron Maiden ranking review, you know, video series really that I made last time, a couple of years ago, because that was made into a couple of different parts, like 3 different parts, and I was kind of rambling on, and I didn't really like how that turned out, and I would like to, and I don't really agree that much with that list anymore. So I think I'm gonna make an updated video for that one. I'm not sure when that's gonna come out, but yeah, either that or maybe I'm gonna talk about my favorite pop albums. I don't know. So overall, I hope you somehow enjoyed this video. Tell me about what albums you liked a lot when you were around this age, you know, 11 to 12, and whether you like them as much today. So yeah, again, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.